Hi, welcome to Between Two Humans. What is between the two humans? One frog. Wonderful. Hi, so today we're going to be talking about universal design for learning and why the disability community advocates for it. So, this is Brooks, the head of OAS here on campus, and OAS is the Office of Accessibility Services, if you didn't know. Brooks, tell me a little bit about your background with disability advocacy and how that ties into inclusive education.
Yeah, so I'm Brooks, I'm the director here, and I'm also the president of Connecticut Ahead, which is the Association of Higher Education and Disability. So I have a couple years in that role now, and that's really helped me collaborate with not just Eastern disability advocates, but anyone across Connecticut. So that definitely has helped me. I have a background in elementary education and also a specialization in higher ed.
So, Brooks, I was wondering, do you think that we're serving students properly, like disabled students, with our current system of special education?
Well, I think the education system in general wasn't designed to serve a lot of people. I think historically it's a gatekeeping and elitist place. So if we come in with that, we can look at our processes, our protocols, and try to start dismantling what isn't needed and what's exclusionary. So there are some supports available legally. There's supports here socially and culturally just because we've built it, but I don't believe our current system of education best serves the disabled population.
Yeah. Do you think that there is things that we could do to be better, like just within the system that we have, or do you think that we need to start implementing like entirely new priorities within the system?
So I think right now the accommodation process is kind of our fix to the current system. So it's kind of that band-aid approach of there's a barrier, it exists systematically. How do we try to add something or remove something that can assist a disabled person go over that barrier? Yeah. But I think the best practice would be to use universal design, go in and redesign what is existing.
So why do you think that it's important that we listen to adult disability advocates when we're talking about how to teach disabled children?
Well, I think the lived experiences really speak higher than maybe a family's perception of what someone might need or what they have needed in the past. And I think the best way to keep up with someone's needs is directly asking that person. I think that disability advocates need to be welcome to the table more in making those decisions, especially systematically, not just in a classroom, not in a separate classroom, but at the table making those administrative decisions.
Do you think that there is a space for the opinions of parents in special education? Do you think that there needs to be a better balance? Or do you think that maybe we should stop kind of listening to the opinions of parents and start listening to the opinions of the students?
So I think like familial history and background is super important, but I think it should be treated not as the end all of support. I think it should be more like a consideration. So just like there's certain evaluations for someone's individually, there are like family evaluations that can be considered. And I think it's important to note, but I think it depends on who you place in the captaincy. And I think a lot of K through 12 very much has the family as the leader. And here we try to make that shift to the student is the leader.
Do you think that we need to be making that shift earlier so that kids learn self-advocacy earlier?
Absolutely. I think the way that you run a PPT or an IEP or a 504 or all the letters that we could name, I think there's ways where, yes, a young child, you might not think they can make those decisions, but just like a teacher gives those options that are appropriate and lets that toddler, choose, an adult or a young kid can still be given, here's your rights, here's your options, here's what this means, transparently, now choose. Yeah. And not close the door on that decision. Welcome, let's read, try.
Making, instead of having a large open-ended, what do you need, say, here's what we can provide for you, which ones sound appropriate, which ones sound like they would help you, and then alongside a parent, they can say, well, here's what I think I need.
Absolutely.
And that would be more helpful with self-advocacy.
Absolutely, and it can start in like kindergarten. It can start sooner because I think the more leadership and empowerment you give someone, the better their pride and sense of identity will come through.
So you say that it's important to put an emphasis on disability as identity instead of disability as something to be fixed. Is there ways that you suggest people do that in a classroom, especially in a secondary education classroom?
Yeah, just like other identity groups that we kind of focus more so on taking note of advocates for them to look up to, putting them into literature, putting them into assignments and projects. Can you kind of uplift every intersection, not just the ones that we find as diversity? There's a lot of books out there, there's a lot of activities for getting some understanding on access, barriers, and disability pride.
So in terms of scaffolding education, we were taught about disability in this class, but we're also being taught about English language learners in some of our other classes and how we can scaffold for them. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's a big difference between the ways that we scaffold for these two groups? Because we're being taught that it's easy to misdiagnose ELLs as students with learning disabilities because of their inaccessibility to things like literature and things like that.
I think it's a fine line. I think it's pretty similar. I think it's all about, if you remove kind of the label of either ELL or disability, it's about there's a barrier there. Yeah. So, speech and language disabilities and ELL might get the same resources, but sometimes ELL doesn't get as many as the disability might due to their labeling and legal mandated accommodations. But there's audiobooks, there's different flexibility, there's options of different assessment. Can people perform better orally? Can they perform better in written? Trying to meet people where they're at to assess like where they are at, as opposed to enforcing this strict, straight path to get to success.
And so this kind of ties into universal design in that if we made accommodations easier to get for everyone, then you wouldn't have to label someone as an ELL. You wouldn't have to label somebody as somebody with a disability unless they chose to self-disclose, because then every student, regardless of ability, would be getting what they needed in the classroom because we're scaffolding every lesson for any child who needs it, right?
And you said that great. I think even further is it's not even accommodations at that point. If we did universal design, any group at all, and of course my experience is more so in higher ed, and look at all the populations we have at Eastern. You might have undocumented students, people who are single family, people who are ELL, people who, right, like
first generation
and if you build it for, in mind with effectiveness, with intention, more people will be able to have access. And so that whole different scaffolding, different kind of menu for different labels will become less needed.
Because the whole classroom will be one menu for every student who's in the classroom.
You've thought of the unexpected, and it might seem like more work up front, but it really has better enrichment and engagement for the students.
And regardless of ability or marginalized identity, every child has a bad day. Mm-hmm. And I think that what I like most about UDL is that every child feels like their bad days are respected in the same way that their peers are, and they don't feel the need to bully or to make fun of their disabled peers or their ELL peers because they're getting the same help. They're getting the same respect from their teachers because it's not mandated by the ADA. It's just the way that we do education at
culturally.
That point.
It's a culture. You're describing a culture shift that I think should happen for sure.
So in our classrooms, we've been talking a lot about self-advocacy and how we encourage that in our students, because I think that as future teachers, we all want our students to have that skill going into life and going into college, especially when accommodations are not as mandated as they are when you're in middle school and high school setting. So how do you feel about that kind of idea of self-advocacy and how we as teachers can encourage it in our students?
Yeah, and I think self-advocacy is such a buzzword for people, and I think I want to make it very clear there's a difference between instilling that self-advocacy pride and self-advocacy internalized ableism and blame of you should have spoken up, you should have reported this, you should be a leader, but then we don't actually listen to their voice, or we say, meet us on the 4th floor, there's no elevator, right? So it's about creating that space for them to have that leadership. And as we mentioned in an earlier question, having them have that leadership role and deciding their accommodation plans, understanding that they are in charge of that. I think that, practicing having them communicate what they need for you. If a parent is really adamant on taking over that meeting, change your body, shift it towards that student, give them those opportunities. I think that's super important.
Yeah. I think that the giving students the tools rather than just expecting them to know is something that we as educators for every student need to be more aware of that students come to us blank slates, and that we need to give them the tools to do the things that we would like them to do. And especially with students with disabilities, that it is a lot more important for us to be giving them those tools, because they're coming in with people expecting them not to be able to do those things in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, historically they're taught to not try something difficult or not actually overcome something. And when people try to do the self-advocacy spiel, sometimes it can come from a place of that medical cure-fix model of, you are the problem, you need to fix this. Yeah. And it's kind of... I imagine someone drowning and you're like, why didn't you ask for help? Well, you were filled with water. You couldn't raise your hand above the water. The lifeguard didn't see you. How is that your
Nobody
fault?
gave you floaties in the first place.
Yeah.
They just expected that you would either not go in because you knew you would drown, or you were going to go in and figure it out on your way there.
Yeah, you weren't taught to swim. You weren't given any supports, and then it was your fault. Yeah.
So in a lot of conversations with other disability advocates, I've heard the phrase access versus success. Could you go a little bit more into detail about what that means and how that kind of plays into the educational setting of like a secondary classroom?
Oh, absolutely. So K through 12, you're all about success, because the No Child Left Behind, the IDEA, the laws that you're under are about getting that student out and graduated. You can alter grades, you can redo things, you could have completely untimed tests and things that aren't exactly building the skills needed for when they move on, because it's not expected that they move on. The only goal is graduate due to the No Child Left Behind and all the laws that we just stated. Like, it is not building true success. It is not actually allowing that person to develop skills or even have a fair shot. It's just passing them along. Whereas in college, I can only give you accommodations that remove barriers and provide access. Hopefully, success follows in that way.
I know in my own experience with OAS, there have been accommodations that I thought would have been helpful, and then in meetings, they were like, well, would this make things worse for you? And I had to sit there and be like, yeah, I do think it would, because we're not just handing out accommodations, we're saying, well, is this going to actually help you have access to the classroom so that you can use your own merits to succeed, rather than saying, well, here's any accommodation that you want, please get out of my office.
That's a big myth to misunderstanding here, is that there's just some like bullet candy and I'm just sprinkling it to the people, but it's not this set menu based on, you have this, you get these. It's an individual holistic approach to finding what is actually going to become, that successful path, but without hindering that rigor. Yeah.
So in terms of how we use UDL right now, we're kind of being taught that it's an option for the classroom alongside a lot of other different options that we're still kind of figuring out in terms of what special education means in America. How do we start to move away from it as an option and more towards it as a standard? It absolutely should be a best practice, and I'm not saying that every professor or teacher out there needs to UDL their entire classroom for the entire year, but start with one project, start with one assignment, build up from there. They'll be surprised that actually it will save time in the long run. It will save money for the school system, for and also for, this whole office, right? We are, again, that Band-Aid. We're not the UDL. We're here moving a bunch of those kind of resources around. That's a lot of money and time. Exactly. Whereas if we built it so that it was sustainable and independently, works for that individual, it would just bring more success again. We'd be putting you out of a job, but we'd be happy. All of these students into a better situation. I'd be fine with being a universal design director. Not out of a job completely, but I would love to change the title. A universal design advisor. I think that fits you. If this job would shift or change, I would not be upset at having to find a new line of work. I think that a lot of disability advocates agree that the goal is not to continue to have to fight. It's to get to a place where we're stable enough that we don't have to fight anymore. Absolutely. Or we can fight in different ways. The work I do is not sustainable. Yeah. My office serves 27% of our population. We have over 1,000 students registered here, and our staff is not large. What we do right now with the individual, it is not sustainable, and it is not the most effective thing we could be providing. I don't think that I knew. I don't know if my classmates knew that 27% of Eastern students get accommodations through OAS. Yes. But just imagine how many students that went back when they were in elementary school or in middle school and high school when those were mandated. Yes. So I think that that's really interesting. It's a number not a lot of people know. Yeah. So in the conversation so far, we've talked about disability as a culture, fostering self-advocacy, promoting access versus success, and utilizing UDL. How do you think bringing these things as a standard into our middle school and high school classrooms can help prepare students for college and beyond, especially students with disabilities?
Well, I think firstly, the first point you bring up was disability as a culture. I think that's probably the most important one to work on as middle school and high school teachers or counselors, whatever your peers are going to be. Because if you have a sense of pride, if you have a sense of identity, of belonging, of community, you're going to be retained, you're going to graduate, you're going to be more successful, you're going to be more prepared for the workplace, you're going to be more engaged with what are your successes, what are your strengths, what are your attributes that as a disabled person or whatever, replace disabled, whatever identity, what does that bring to the table for employment, for employability? There are tons of people who are in Silicon Valley who have ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and they are successful coders, successful people in huge tech industries, and people don't see disability as a benefit, and that shift starts with culture and identity.
Definitely. And so bringing that into the classroom is the first step in helping students succeed, because they know that they're succeeding not in spite of their disability, but because that gives them special abilities, that gives them a leg up in life because they have a different view of the world. And I think that is how you promote success, by giving access.
Absolutely.
And I think that so having UDL is really what is preparing disabled students for the workplace and for college and for anything that you want beyond just getting them out and graduating them through what No Child Left Behind.
Absolutely. I think UDL is the future. I think by the time y'all are actually teaching a couple years in, it's going to be what we know and what we do, and it will be best practice. So I think the way that we're learning to be teachers is going to be outdated very quickly, and I hope so. Yeah.
I think that it's amazing that we have a class like inclusive secondary classrooms where we're being taught to think about this stuff before it becomes part of our everyday lives.
Yes.
And where we had our the second language learning class, we're being taught to think of the different types of students that we're going to encounter, and I think that that's the first step, is making us aware of what we're going to have to do to foster a UDL classroom. And I thank you very much for sitting down and talking to me about universal design for learning and how it can help us in our future careers.
Absolutely. Just remember that, like you just said, UDL and thinking about access first. It's not about how cool and creative your lesson plan is. It's not about the knowledge or the content even. It's about access at first. So thanks for having me. Shameless plug for getting you an A, I hope.
A? Wendy wants me to get an A. Between Two Humans.
Wendy.